Welcome to the College Park Church of Christ Sermon Series podcast. This sermon was recorded at the College Park Church of Christ in the Conroe Porter area. Join us for worship on Sundays at 10:30 a.m. and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Thanks for studying the Word of God with us.
I'm not trying to bring down the mood, but I do want to talk about Lamentations this afternoon. It's a book about lamenting. The reason I have this is because about a year ago I decided to study the book of Lamentations. It's something that I hadn't really studied in depth before, and I decided to do that. Felt like it was something I should do, and maybe I'd get something good out of it, and I feel like I did get a lot of good things out of it. So I want to present those things to you this afternoon, and perhaps you'll benefit from it as well. There's really some surprising things in the book of Lamentations that I want to show you this afternoon. I want to give a little bit of background to this book. I like timelines. I'm a timeline guy. So here's a timeline. This is a timeline of the Old Testament, way back starting with the beginning of everything, around 4000 BC. You have the patriarchal age, as we call it, when God spoke through the patriarchs. Then comes 2,500 years later. Mount Sinai is depicted there. There's probably not snow on top of it, but just to show that it's not a triangle, it's a mountain. That's the depiction of Mount Sinai. That's around 1500 BC. Moses came along. He received the Old Testament law on this mountain, and thus began what we call the Mosaical age. About 500 years later, God's people have camped in Israel, the Promised Land. The kings come along. They ask for a king. Even though God said, you don't need a king, I'm your king, he allowed them to have a king anyway. But they got a king. Saul came along, then David, then Solomon, and then Rehoboam, and then there was a revolt with Jeroboam, and then the kingdom split, and there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And so around 600 BC, we see a catastrophic event that we refer to as the Babylonian exile. So I want to zoom in on that time frame just a bit. Timeline of the Babylonian exile, about 100 years before that, 722-ish BC, the northern kingdom was taken captive or fell to Assyria. You can read that in 2 Kings 17 and 18. And then around the year 600 BC, the beginning of the Babylonian exile started, and you can read that in different places. Daniel 1, for example, 607 BC, where Daniel is one of those people that was exiled, taken from Jerusalem, and brought to a faraway country, a nation, Babylon, and was deported there. And that was around 607 BC, and then 587 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed. You can read that in 2 Kings 24 and 25, and we'll read a little bit about how that happened. And then 537 BC, they were released from exile, and you can read that in Ezra and Nehemiah. So the Babylonian exile was a catastrophic event for God's people. It was a result of their own sin, their own rejection of God, and so it's sort of a punishment in that way, that a foreign nation would come in and conquer their land and deport many of them to a faraway place. Lamentations was believed to be written, shortly after Jerusalem was destroyed. So that's the belief, that Lamentations was written right after this catastrophic event that happened to God's people. And the author of Lamentations believed to be Jeremiah, who lived in this time frame. So he lived before the exile to Babylon, and he witnessed the exile, and he lived afterwards, after Jerusalem was destroyed. So Jeremiah the prophet is believed to be the author of the book of Lamentations, and the lamenting that's happening in Lamentations is lamenting all of this that just happened. The exile, the destruction of Jerusalem, this foreign nation coming in, destroying everything they had built, and taking all the people, many lives lost, and many people brought out of their home country to a faraway place. That's believed to be the lamenting that's going on in the book of Lamentations. So that's kind of the context and the background, the history behind the purpose of this book and what this book is lamenting. I want to read a little bit more into this event in 2 Kings 25, 1 through 3, and verses 8 and 9 as well. It says, "Now it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and encamped against it. And they built a siege wall against it all around. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land." Skipping to verse 8 says, "In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great, he burned with fire." So this is the scriptural description of what we just talked about, the besieging of Jerusalem. And here's an artistic representation of what that might have looked like. But this foreign nation came in and built a siege wall, which means they surrounded Jerusalem. They surrounded this city, and they built a barricade of some sort around the city, and they camped there so that they were trapping the inhabitants inside, and everyone, they couldn't come out, they couldn't go in, or at least had to go through the barricade if they did. And so the idea of this siege was they were going to weaken Jerusalem to the point where they could conquer it. So they trapped them there, and some historians believe it was maybe 30 months that they were trapped. They were taking siege in Jerusalem. And so the siege lasted a long time, and eventually the people were weakened. They weren't able to really fight. Famine had stricken them. Many died of starvation. And then the armies came in, and they just wiped out the city because they were in that dilapidated, weakened state. And you see that they set fire to the city, and they leveled things to the ground. They destroyed the temple. Utter destruction. And this was a monumental event in the history of God's people, because Jerusalem was the center of their worship. It was the center of their government. It was the center of their spiritual history. It housed the temple where God and his presence dwelt. It was the center of everything for them. And a foreign nation came in and destroyed it and leveled it to the ground. A terrible event in the history of God's people. Lamentations is lamenting that event. It has 5 chapters. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the book, because this is interesting as well. The book is poetry. It's Hebrew poetry. So it may not sound like poetry to us, like we know poetry, but it is poetry. And it's also acrostic poetry, which means that each verse starts with another letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So if you notice in the book of Lamentations, every chapter except the 3rd chapter has 22 verses, and that's because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So it starts with their letter A, and I know it's not A, but whatever their A letter is, it starts with A. That's the first verse, and then B, C, so forth with their alphabet. And it's 22 letters, starts each verse. The 3rd chapter has 66 verses, but it follows the same pattern, because every 3 verses starts with a letter, the next letter of the alphabet. So it follows that same acrostic style of poetry, which was interesting to me. But it's not uncommon to the Bible. You can find that also in the book of Psalms. And it's just a way that they wrote, and I think it spoke to the time and dedication that they put into writing these words to make it really come across to the reader, and also the effort they put into putting their heart into the scripture that they're writing down. And that was a way for them to do that, to write in this poetry. Chapter 5 is still considered poetry, but it's not acrostic. And there's some conjecture as to why chapter 5 is not an acrostic style, and some conjecture is that at this point perhaps Jeremiah, the author, had said, I've written all these things in acrostic so far. Now I'm just going to let it all out in chapter 5, and I'm not going to try and follow this structure of acrostic poetry, but I'm just going to let it out in chapter 5. Perhaps that's why he did that. But that I thought was pretty interesting in the book of Lamentations. But it is 5 chapters long. Adam Clark commentary says this, or it's referring to someone else, Dr. South. Dr. South says this: one would think that every letter was written with a tear, every word the sound of a breaking heart, that the author was compacted of sorrows, disciplined to grief from his infancy, one who never breathed but in sighs, nor spoke but in a groan. So the tone of the book is sorrow. It's lamenting. And this person said you would think that every letter was written with a tear. So someone crying while they're writing these letters, someone very deeply emotional and deeply sorrowful in their heart. And that's what you can feel when you read the book of Lamentations. So I'd like to go through each chapter of the book of Lamentations and just kind of give a summary to present this book to you. The first chapter I've titled The Widowed Woman. So let's read some verses from Lamentations 1. Lamentations 1, verses 1 and 2. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she, who was great among the nations. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So he starts out with this analogy of a widowed woman, a woman who's lost everything. It says that this place, and it's referring to Jerusalem, and it's comparing Jerusalem to this woman. But it says this place, this was a princess among the provinces, and now it's become a slave. It says this woman weeps bitterly in the night. Her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. And so you get this depiction of a woman that's on her knees and just crying and crying throughout the night because she just lost everything. Perhaps you can relate to that in some way in your life, losing something, losing someone, something, and you're just brought to tears to the point where you can barely breathe because you're so sorrowful. And you're on your knees and you're crying to God, and everything feels like it's fallen apart. And there's none to comfort you. That's where Jerusalem was at this point. That's where Jerusalem's people were at this point. They felt like everything was lost, and there was no one to give them comfort. And they couldn't stop the tears. And I've seen that with my kids, and you've probably seen that with kids before, where they're just crying and crying, and they can't even get a breath in. And in particular, my niece, Julia, she would have bouts of tears and crying where she just wouldn't breathe. She'd start to turn different color, and we'd all be looking at her and telling her, breathe, breathe. And she wouldn't breathe. She'd just be like with her mouth open, crying. Finally, she'd take a breath, and we'd all take a sigh because she was blue at that point. But it's just weird that sometimes you cry so much that you can't get a breath in. You're so upset. You just can't stop the tears from coming down. And that's the point where these people were, and that's the analogy here, that Jerusalem and its inhabitants are like a widowed woman. Lamentations 1, verse 7, it says, in the days of her affliction and roaming, Jerusalem remembers all her pleasant things that she had in the days of old. Perhaps this strikes a tone with you as well, remembering things that we had before. Sometimes we don't recognize the value of something until we lose it. And then we long for that thing to come back. We long for that missing thing to be returned to us, to have that again, whether it's a person, a thing, whatever it is that we lost. We miss those things. And sometimes that causes sorrow within us. We remember all the pleasant things that we used to have, and we long for them. Lamentations 1, verse 16, for these things I weep, my eye overflows with water, because the Comforter who should restore my life is far from me. My children are desolate because the enemy prevailed. So again, continuing this analogy of this woman of weeping, and there's no one to comfort them. And sometimes we are inconsolable. where we just can't find comfort. No matter how much we desire it, we feel inconsolable and we're crying and we just can't stop the tears from coming. That's the point that Jerusalem was at. So the people lost a lot of things. They lost people and they lost possessions. So I want to try and, again, make this as personal as we can. I know we can't really relate one-to-one with what Jerusalem went through, but try and think of things in your life that have happened before. And I think in this area we can probably bring up natural disasters like a hurricane or tornado. And I know there's been some damage from both of those things recently in recent years, and even some property loss in this congregation. And when those things happen, even if it's just our home, if we lose our home through fire or hurricane, whatever, that's a tough thing to deal with. Not just the financial loss, but there's some emotional loss there. And I don't want to minimize losing possessions, because things like our home and our possessions, sometimes they hold sentimental value to us. And I remember watching the news with like Hurricane Harvey, and you watch the news and these interviews of people who lost their home, and a lot of times they'd bring up things that they lost inside, like old photographs or old wedding photos or things that their kids had made or something like that. And there's great sorrow there. There's great sorrow in losing sentimental things and even moving away from a home that you lived in, all the memories and all the things that you enjoyed there. There's an emotional attachment to losing possessions. And so this certainly happened to them. They were not only lost their homes, and their homes were destroyed, they were taken out of their homes, those that lived, and brought to a faraway place, faraway country, and totally disconnected from their home. Many of them. Some of them were allowed to stay, but many of them were deported to a faraway place. And so they lost great possession and great emotional pain happened there. But also the loss of people. Certainly even more than the loss of possessions, losing loved ones. This certainly happened as well in this siege and in this destruction. And perhaps all of us here have felt that in some way, the pain of losing someone we love. And to have it happen this way in a disaster like this would be a tough thing to go through. You think about the siege, and we're going to read more about it, but terrible things happened in that siege. There was famine, there was starvation, and terrible loss of life. There was fire and destruction from the army. So it's certainly a terrible time for this people. So try and imagine that if you can, and think about those times in your life that somewhat relate to this in terms of losing people and losing possessions, and the pain that you feel in that. That's what they were going through in this moment. Chapter 2 I've titled Sorrow Intensified. So let's look at some of the verses from chapter 2. Lamentations 2, verses 6 through 7. He has done violence to his tabernacle, as if it were a garden. He has destroyed his place of assembly. The Lord has caused the appointed feasts and Sabbaths to be forgotten in Zion. In his burning indignation, he has spurned the king and the priest. The Lord has spurned his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. He has given up the walls of her palaces into the hand of the enemy. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord as on the day of a set feast. So here Jeremiah starts out by saying he has done violence to his tabernacle. The he that he's referring to is God. He's saying God has done this. God has done violence to his own tabernacle as if it were a garden. He's destroyed the place of assembly. It says that he spurned the king and the priest. He spurned his altar. He abandoned his sanctuary. So now we learn a little bit more about why all this is happening and who's behind it, and really, God's behind it. God is doing this to them. So imagine now that we have faced destruction like a hurricane or a tornado or something terrible happened to us in our life, and then we find out God was behind it. It was on purpose, and God was the person on purpose allowing these things to happen to us. Wouldn't that make it even worse to know that God was behind this? And that's what Jeremiah is recognizing here. Now, there's a reason God is doing this, and we'll talk about it. But he recognized the fact that God is behind this. And then he says, in this verse, he says, not only is God behind this, but he's rejected the king and the priests. He has spurned his altar. He has abandoned his sanctuary. So not only has God caused destruction upon Jerusalem or allowed it to happen, he has rejected the spirituality of the nation. So he's rejected them spiritually. So to talk about that for a moment, again, let's make it personal for you here. So we talked about losing your home, losing loved ones. Now imagine losing this church building. Y'all just paid off this church building, and that's a great time of celebration. Well, imagine something happened next week and this church building was just leveled to the ground, and how awful that would be, and how much sorrow and pain that would be. That's what people were experiencing with the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the temple had stood for 500 plus years. For 500 plus years, this was the center of their worship. And now it was destroyed. The center of their kingdom and their spirituality and where they came to bring sacrifices to God, it was destroyed, and they had to watch it burn. They watched it burn to the ground. Not only that, they realized that it was God doing this, because God had rejected their priest and king. God had spurned his altar. So imagine hearing, not only was this building destroyed, but then realizing that God did it because God was rejecting the worship that we had been doing here. Because God was displeased with how we were functioning as a church. And it was our own fault. And God rejected our spiritual worship and said, I don't like the way you've worshiped me, I don't accept it, and now you're facing judgment. How much guilt and pain would we feel and sorrow knowing all of this? And this is what Jeremiah is lamenting here with God's people. Lamentations 2, verse 20 through 21. See, O Lord, and consider, to whom have you done this? Should the women eat their offspring, the children they have cuddled? Should the priest and prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie on the ground in the streets. My virgins and my young men have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered and not pitied. Again, Jeremiah seemingly boldly calling out God, but acknowledging that God is allowing this to happen, to slaughter these people, for these people to be slain, for this great pain of starvation, and for the prophet and priest to be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord. So again, recognizing that God is behind this destruction and how much sorrow that would bring to our heart. So God rejected their worship and rejected their tabernacle. Let's continue on to chapter 4. I'm going to skip over chapter 3, and there's a reason for that, and we'll come back to it at the end. But I want to move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 kind of gives us the root cause of it all and why all this is happening. We get a little insight into that. So let's read Lamentations 4, verses 4 through 6. It says, the tongue of the infant clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, but no one breaks it for them. Those who ate delicacies are desolate in the streets. Those who were brought up in scarlet embrace ash heaps. The punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment with no hand to help her. So in chapter 4, you see this theme of comparing the old times to the current times. The old times that were good and how good things were, and now how terrible things are. And you see that comparison here. Those who ate delicacies are now desolate in the street. Those who were brought up in scarlet or royalty and luxury are now embracing ash heaps and in pain and mourning. In the first verse, it says, the tongue of the infant clings to the roof of its mouth for thirst. So the infants were so thirsty and their mouth was so dry that their tongue clinged to the roof of their mouth. And you think about that and just how terrible that is, imagining that with our own children. And so the lamenting goes on in chapter 4. It says, the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom. So in verse 6, it gives us a little bit insight into why this is all happening. It says, the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people. This is a punishment of the iniquity of the people, or the sin of the people. Lamentations 4 verse 11 says, the Lord has fulfilled his fury. He has poured out his fierce anger. He kindled a fire in Zion and has devoured its foundations. Verse 13, because of the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests who shed in her midst the blood of the just. So now we know the root cause. The root cause for all of this suffering is sin. And it's the sin of God's people. God didn't want to do this to his people. God didn't take pleasure in causing people to suffer and to die and to starve. There was no pleasure in God's eyes in all this, but it was necessary in his eyes because people over and over had rejected him. And you look at the history of God's people, even in the times of electing a king, but from the get-go, their history was times of rejection. You see a pattern of rejection and rebellion against God, and they'd reform a little bit, but then they would just reject him again. And God warned them over and over about this rejection, and if they kept rejecting God, God would reject them. And this is the fruition of that happening. God is rejecting them and punishing them for the repeated iniquities of the people. So it's not God wanting to do this, and he's not the blame for it. Sin is to blame. And that's something I think we should take from all of this suffering, how terrible it was. God is not to blame for all of this suffering. And God is not to blame for the suffering in your life. He's not to blame for the suffering in our life. And in this world, God is not to blame. He allows it to happen, but he's not the reason for it. Sin is the reason. Sin is to blame. My sin, your sin. And it's always been that way. From the very beginning, suffering was brought into this world because of our sin. When Adam and Eve sinned, that's when death and suffering came into this world. God didn't bring it in. We did. And it's because of our sin that suffering happens in this life. And maybe our suffering isn't a direct result of a sin we just committed. Maybe it's a result of someone else's sin or just the result of sin throughout time. But all of it goes back to the source of sin and our decision to sin against God. And we all have a part to play in that. So imagine this giant bucket of sin. We've all deposited a little bit of sin into that bucket. All the sin that ever occurred in this world. We've all put a little bit of sin into that bucket. And out of that sin flows all suffering and death and pain. So we're all to blame for the suffering of this life. God is not to blame. And that's a key point I want to make here. Though God allowed it, sin is to blame. And Jeremiah acknowledges this in chapter 4. Chapter 5, I've titled A Plea for Restoration. So this is the chapter where he abandons the acrostic style and he just goes straight into pleading to God to restore them. We can find this in Lamentations 5, verse 1. Remember, O Lord, who has come upon us. Look and behold our reproach. So now he's crying out to God, God, remember us, help us, look upon us, behold the suffering and the reproach we've endured. Verses 15 through 17, the joy of our heart has ceased, our dance has turned into mourning, the crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes grow dim. And so Jeremiah again is saying, woe to us. Our joy has ceased. It's because of our sin. He acknowledges that again. He says, our heart is faint. Our eyes are growing dim. And then verses 19 through 22, the last verses of the book, it says, you, O Lord, remain forever. Your throne from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever and forsake us for so long a time? Turn us back to you, O Lord, and we will be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. So this is Jeremiah's final plea to God. He acknowledges God's supremacy. He says, God, you remain forever. Your throne's from generation to generation. He's crying out in pain again. Why are you forgetting us? Why are you forsaking us for so long a time? Turn back to us. Help us. Restore us. And that's his final plea to God. And perhaps you've been in a position like this before, where you're crying out to God, as we talked about this morning, this point where we're crying out to God for help. That's where the people were at this time. So they were desperate for God's restoration. So at least at the end here, he is acknowledging that God is the only one that can restore them, and he seeks the restoration from God. So these are 4 points we can make about the book of Lamentations, but there's one more chapter before we close, and this is the middle chapter, chapter 3. And you could title this chapter different titles. I've chosen The Suffering Man because a good portion of it is an analogy of a suffering man in chapter 3. But there's also some very interesting things in this chapter, and really this chapter is the reason that I put together this sermon, because I found it very interesting and perhaps will be interesting to you as well. But chapter 3 I've titled The Suffering Man. So it starts out in Lamentations 3, verses 1 through 5. It says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. He has aged my flesh and my skin and broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and woe. So you see this poetry now of a suffering man. And he says, I am the man who's seen great suffering and affliction. So imagine this perhaps older gentleman who's walking in darkness. He says he can't see, and he's being led, and he can't see the light. And he's turned his hand against me time and time. So God has caused great pain and suffering on this man throughout the day. His flesh is aged. His skin is aged. His bones are brittle, perhaps broken, it says here. It says, he has besieged me. He has surrounded me with bitterness and woe. So everything around me feels bitter and woeful and sorrowful. And so you get this portrait of an old man that's suffering in this way. In verses 10 through 12, he makes direct references to God. He says, he has been to me a bear lying in wait, like a lion in ambush. He has turned aside my ways and torn me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me up as a target for the arrow. So he continues talking about how God has just punished him. And he likens him to a bear lying in wait, like a bear hiding in wait, and you're walking on a path, and here comes the bear to attack. That's what God has been like to him, like a lion in ambush. It says he's also like a warrior, perhaps, in verse 12, who has a bow, and I'm the target. So this great warrior has this bow and these arrows, and I'm the target for those arrows. That's how he feels God is treating him in these times, as if he's the target for all the suffering. And so he uses these analogies to, again, liken his emotions and to describe how he feels God is treating him in these moments. But then, right in the middle of this chapter, the book takes a different turn. And there's something I found very interesting in the middle of this chapter, because it's a very different tone. It's a very different message. We've looked at all 5 chapters, and we've seen all these different verses about lamenting and sorrow and pain and all the struggles that they endured in this catastrophic event. Perhaps we can relate to those things. But right in the center of this book, there's this message. Perhaps it will remind you of something. It says this, my soul still remembers and sinks within me. And this I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. What a positive message this is, right in the middle of an awful, suffering, lamenting type book. Right in the center of this book is a phrase that we have sung about for thousands of years. Great is your faithfulness. And that was so surprising to me. I hadn't realized that before. I may have read it before and not realized it. But this is the source of those words. The book of Lamentations is the source of these powerful words that we sing about in several different songs. Great is your faithfulness. And that's what really inspired me in my study in the book of Lamentations. That in the midst of all this sorrow and pain, Jeremiah recognized that the only hope he had was God. No matter all the pain and all the sorrow, and even though God had a hand in all this suffering and allowed it to happen, the only way out, the only hope, the only light at the end of the tunnel is God. And how great God is. And he begins to praise God in the middle of all this. He says, great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. He says before that, his compassions fail not. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. I have hope in God. The Lord is good. That was amazing to me to find that right in the center of this book of Lamentations. That there's this great, powerful message of how great God is and great his faithfulness is. And so that's the message I want to leave with you from this study. And there's a lot more you can study in this context in this book. But I want to leave this with you, that no matter how dark the day seems or how awful things get, no matter how much pain and sorrow you feel, or you begin to question, why is this happening to me? You question God and say, why are you setting me as your target? Am I suffering in this way? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? Don't forget to praise God and say, great is your faithfulness. Without you, I have no hope. Without God, we have no hope. Without God, there would truly be utter pain and sorrow and destruction. But with him, and because of his faithfulness, when we have not been faithful to him, he is still faithful to us. And he is the only source of hope and guidance and comfort in this life. Great is his faithfulness.
Thanks for joining our Sermon Series podcast today. For more, check us out on YouTube or come worship with us on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings.